This video was intended to be much longer, almost 10 hours long in fact. Due to unforeseen complications though, I'm instead going to upload it in a series of smaller parts. If you haven't seen part 1, I highly recommend you start there before continuing. Link in the description. Kirei Kotomine makes 2 brief appearances in the prologue episode, the first being a recorded message played on Rin's home phone, informing about the deadline to entry. The second time, Rin calls him back to request that she officially be listed as a master in the war. Kirei informs her about an item that was left to him by her father that he wants to give to her, though more likely he's using this as an excuse to get more information out of her regarding her plans for the war. Though he is unsuccessful. It's a nice touch to show that he's invested in understanding any of the other masters as much as possible, though this does fall apart because we never learn what gift Kirei was talking about, and it's never mentioned again, not even when Rin takes Shiro to the church in episode 2. This is the part where I really don't have as much to say about the character, because out of all the routes adapted into anime anyway, Kirei seems to have the least relevance to this one. I've tried to examine these characters based on their appearances in this anime alone, but I really can't for this one, because the show truly expects you to know who Kirei is before going into Bladeworks, just as I assumed they would for the visual novel. And that's saying a lot since it still bothers giving him an introduction. Which does raise a couple questions what the creators intended you to experience before going into this. Kirei's overall absence being left unexplained in this route does point to the idea that you should have seen the Dean animation before watching Bladeworks, but the existence of an introduction at all raises further questions. Why reintroduce a character we're supposed to already know through a scene that we've already watched? Even Heaven's Feel skipped most of the opening, and reduced much of the church scene, expecting you to know things already, which I appreciate. It makes it very clear that this is not where you should start with Fate. And this isn't the anime's fault, but rather a symptom of UFOTable's poor handling of these adaptations and their order of release. And that's coming from someone who hasn't even read the visual novel yet. Did they really expect you to have watched an anime that came out nearly a decade prior, or were they expecting the people who had watched Zero to jump directly into this? Unless they really do expect you to have read the visual novel entirely before going into it, even though that kind of defeats one of the main points of an adaptation, but we can talk about that in our final conclusion. As mentioned, Kirei seems to be more of a puppet master than anything. He has invested interest in convincing Shiro to join the war, and acts as a motivator to push conflicts to their conclusion. At least, I assume he's pulling the strings in some way. We don't really know what progress he's made in the past 2 weeks, or see much else in the episodes after. Even the information gathered from Lancer doesn't seem to come up in any notable way either, if it does at all, which is in stark contrast with Kirei's servant in Zero, whose information gathering had a large effect on many different plot points throughout the story. Kirei more so seems to just be waiting until things come to an end. Yeah, like I said, there's not much to analyze, but I do have some criticisms towards the scenes he's in. Kirei tells Shiro about the war and tries to convince him not to quit. When he begins his explanation, he starts by saying that the Holy Grail War isn't something that can be ignored once chosen as a master. This is false, and we learn why in the same conversation. There's also a strange disconnect with this part of his motivation. He continues explaining why only one master can claim the Grail. Shiro still isn't interested and expresses his disdain with the idea of masters killing one another. Rin reassures him that killing the other masters isn't necessary, to which Kirei interjects, This line in particular is very out of place, given the context of the conversation. Kirei doesn't know anything about Shiro beyond who his father is and what he's learned here. And of that which he has learned, Shiro has already told him that he doesn't like the idea that masters have to kill each other. Telling him that killing is unavoidable will only deter him further, if not because of his attitude thus far, then because it would mean that he would have to fight Rin later on. It seems so strange that Kirei would focus on this topic as though it isn't a reason Shiro would want to quit even more. Even Rin eventually concedes that killing all the other masters is necessary to win the Grail, despite being the one initially claiming that that was unnecessary. However, Shiro continues to try to find a way out of the war. He considers that using all of his command seals would solve the problem. Kirei uses a more sensible tactic to convince Shiro to stay by calling him cowardly for considering that, which is at least more effective than his previous methods. Eventually, Shiro considers that the power of the Grail could be claimed by someone evil. Kirei uses this to further push Shiro to join by claiming that it could be stopped if Shiro were to win, though he still isn't convinced.
君が勝ち残れば、少なくとも無差別な殺人者に渡ることはなくなるだろう。俺には戦う理由がない。では聖杯を手に入れた人間が何をする？それによって最悪が起きたとしても興味はないのだ。
As a final attempt, Kirei reveals that the previous Grail War resulted in the fire that killed 500 people. This finally appears to be enough to motivate him, but there's still more. Shiro eventually asks if anyone has ever gotten the Grail before, to which Kirei begins talking about Kiritsugu, although not by name. We can assume that it's Kiritsugu because he speaks and acts as though Kirei has met this man personally. Now why is that important? It's because there's a contradiction in his speech when describing the victor of the past Grail War. First and most notably, he describes the winner as someone who avoided fighting and killing other masters. And, well... I do have to wonder, was Kiritsugu intended to be a pacifist in the visual novel, and that was just changed when Fate Zero was published? That would explain why this description of his character doesn't fit with how he appears in Zero, but even if that were the case, why include this in an adaptation after both the light novel and anime of Fate Zero have come out? It doesn't even matter since this plot element, that you need to kill all of the other masters to be worthy of the Grail, never becomes thematically relevant in this route. Barely anything here matters to Bladeworks, or provided false information that does more to confuse the audience than introduce them to the world. Not to mention Kirei does a pretty poor job at convincing Shiro to stay, and he's lucky he didn't quit altogether, and if I am expected to have watched the Dean animation before this, that just makes the whole scene even more pointless. Overall, I just don't understand why this is the introduction to the route. Hell, nothing said here couldn't have been explained by Rin. This seems more fitting for the kind of story where Kirei is going to play an active role in the story, not one where he's virtually irrelevant. He even taunts Shiro near the end, which is also out of place given where the story goes. This isn't like a visual novel or a video game where all paths branch from a single point that they all share in common, and thus need to return to every new game. This is an anime. And the fact that it's adapting a visual novel doesn't change that. You can still present information from what you're adapting in a way that best works for the new medium you're about to tell that story in, which is why this same scene was done so much better in Heaven's Feel. Imagine if Sakura's introduction from those movies was put here instead, but without any of the significant context that follows. It's just incredibly out of place, and at least that introduction was actually good. Yeah, I like Heaven's Feel in case that wasn't obvious. Kirei appears again in episode 3, but the scene only sets the viewers up for more confusion because, as we'll find out later, all of this focus is wasted on a character who is virtually irrelevant for the next several episodes. Instead, his next appearance is after Ryder's defeat, well into season 1. Shinji comes to the church begging for a new servant, so Kirei gives him Gilgamesh, though the details can be discussed more thoroughly when we get to Ryder's section. Ultimately, this scene doesn't tell us anything new about Kirei's character, much like the last one. He makes one more appearance before the season's end when Castor comes to the church to look for the Holy Grail. She has her familiars attack Kirei, and a fight ensues. We're told that he doesn't want Lancer's help, but we're never told why. If it had something to do with Kirei's relationship with his servant, it could have been explored, but instead, because of how lacking both of these characters have been in their appearances thus far, it's just another scene that shows us how utterly wasted Kirei is as a character. Kirei doesn't make another significant appearance until episode 19. To recap, Archer challenged Shiro to a fight at the Ainsburn Castle and took Rin hostage to leverage his cooperation. Lancer decides to help Saber and Shiro rescue her. This is strange because at the time that Lancer offers his assistance, Archer has already given Rin over to Gilgamesh and Shinji, who might as well be allied with Kirei. She doesn't need to be rescued by anyone, least of all Lancer. This can't be from out-of-date intel either because Kirei can communicate with Lancer telepathically. He did this in episode 1 when ordering Lancer to retreat after his fight with Saber. So Lancer should have received word from his master that they have Rin, but because the story needs Lancer to die, the plot creates yet another contrivance so they can move him into position. Lancer arrives just in time before Shinji begins to be Shinji, but before he can untie Rin, Kirei enters the room. He said that Lancer's orders were to kill Archer rather than to rescue Rin, which makes sense given that she never needed to be rescued, but as mentioned, that's also the problem. Lancer said earlier that he was ordered to rescue Rin. Was Lancer just lying when he said that it was Kirei's orders? And when Kirei reveals what he had planned for Rin, Lancer reaffirms that Kirei did order him to rescue her. If this order to rescue her was issued after she was kidnapped, does that mean that the order to kill Archer was given before all that? If so, why didn't he finish the fight with Archer back at the church? When were these orders made? There's so much information being contradicted or just being left out that it would almost be frustrating if these characters weren't so meaningless to the plot. Kirei finally confesses that he was the one who killed Rin's father in the previous war, and then orders Lancer to kill her so he can use her as the vessel for the Holy Grail. I have no idea why he needs Rin specifically or why Ilya wasn't equally suitable, and we're never told either. Lancer refuses, however, and says that he will only kill her if ordered to via command seal. Being left with no other option, Kirei does exactly that, and orders Lancer once again to terminate Rin Tosaka for him. Of course, if we did that, the story would be over. So no, that's not what happened. Instead, he decides to kill Rin himself, since using a command seal is too beneath him to— Of course he fucking doesn't do that either. He has Shinji kill her for him. Literally any of these things would have made significantly more sense than what actually happens. He uses his command seal to order Lancer to kill himself.
Excuse me, what?
I cannot possibly fathom a reason for this, and I haven't found one either. Why would Kirei purposefully throw away something as valuable as a heroic spirit, especially Kukulain? There's nothing he gains from it. He stands to lose far more still. The only reason I can possibly imagine why he would do this is because Lancer is of no further use to him. But on what grounds is he useless? He is banking a lot on the idea that not Archer or even Saber will come through that door while Gilgamesh isn't around to defend him. He barely knows anything about Shiro or Archer beyond a 10-minute conversation he had with one almost 2 weeks ago, and minimal secondhand information from Lancer about the other. Their fight could end at that moment, or they might not even finish the fight. And given that Gilgamesh lets them go twice in a row, I don't think Kirei can count on him to keep them all in one place in the event one leaves to check up on Rin, which, if I'm being honest, at least one of them should have done, but we'll talk about that later. It's just not safe yet to dispatch his only defense against a servant. He's also overlooking something exceedingly important, that he's still in the same room as an enemy master. Even if not for her command seals, Kirei doesn't know when or if Saber will come through that door to rescue her, and Gilgamesh certainly isn't going to answer when he calls. There is simply no reason to throw one away like it's disposable, not while there are still other enemy servants. And after Lancer kills himself, Kirei prepares to remove Rin's heart. But then Lancer gets back up and kills Kirei.
What? What the fuck?
Lancer was ordered to kill himself. Do you know what happens to people when they are killed? He was basically ordered to die. He had not died yet because he had not killed himself yet. He hadn't completed the task that he was ordered via command seal. This is, quite possibly, one of the worst examples of a Deus Ex Machina that I have ever witnessed in an anime. It also proves my point exactly. If a hostile servant suddenly entered the room, Kirei has no way of defending himself. He would be at Saber's mercy, the same as Lancer's, and it only makes Kirei look that much more like a gigantic fucking idiot. I wish I could say that this was all that was wrong with this scene, but we'll be coming back to it in the future. Lancer eventually succumbs to his wounds. He gets back up a second time after dying, and then dies again, so for all I know, he's still kicking in some form. But as far as Bladeworks is concerned, this is the end of their story. Their incredibly short-lived and near-inconsequential story. On the opposite end of the scale, Zero's Kirei is by no means a poorly written character, nor does his arc reflect poorly on Fate Zero. However, he is a primary example of some of the larger issues with the show. His first appearance is in the second scene of episode 1. Like the church scene from Bladeworks, it's primarily expository and paints the setting of the story for both the audience and Kirei. It also introduces us to an important character trait for Kirei. Despite being chosen for the war, he has no idea why the Grail would choose him. He has no wish he'd ask the Grail, or at least none that he knows of. Normally, a lacking motivation would be quite a critical flaw. In a battle royale like this, understanding the character's motivations and wishes is critical to understanding the conflict. In this case, Kirei's motivation is one that is kept secret from the audience, intended to be revealed later on, rather than indefinitely withheld. So there's nothing wrong with establishing a character with vague or even no initial motivations in this case. But setup still plays a crucial role. Throughout his story, Kirei's misunderstanding of his feelings will play an important role in how he develops and learns more about himself. More on that later. Before the scene ends, we're told that Kirei had a wife that died just days prior, and Risei believes that a new mission will help him move on from his loss. The unfortunate thing is that if his wife plays any part in his character, we never learn what her significance was. And as far as the anime tells us, it isn't important either. Within 3 years, Kirei mastered Magecraft and summoned Assassin. The war is close approaching, and the two are reviewing information gathered on the enemy masters. One more report comes in, this one on Kiritsugu Emiya, referred to as the Mage Killer. He's interested in Kiritsugu's profile, continuing to read it even long after their meeting ends. Tokiyomi thinks he's just a dog in it for the money, but Kirei doesn't seem convinced. From the way the scene cuts back and forth between both he and Kiritsugu, it's implied that he sees similarities between the two of them. Whether he's correct or not is another story. We also get some insight on his character from Kiritsugu. He's exceptional at everything he does, yet shows no interest in any of the fields he practices in. He knows that Kirei doesn't have a wish, and this lack of desire terrifies him. This explanation is a little confusing because it specifically cites Kirei's lack of desire as what's terrifying, instead of a possible desire Kirei could have that isn't satiated by any of the paths he's chosen. Kirei only makes a single appearance in the following episode. He summons Assassin to attack Tokiyomi, only to be killed by Archer as part of their plan to trick the other masters, after which he goes to the church to request asylum. His father rejoices that he'll finally get to see a miracle, but Kirei seems disinterested, a reaction similar to the one he had at the end of his first scene. After the fight between Lancer and Saber ends, one of the assassins informs Kirei about a familiar watching the church, something that's forbidden. Kirei determines it's Kiritsugu's handiwork and uses this as a reason to pursue him for the night. Knowing that Kiritsugu wants to remove the curse on Saber's arm, Kirei uses Kenneth to lure him out. He's instead met with one of Kiritsugu's allies, Maya. Eventually, Kiritsugu stealthily arrives, and using the cover of a smoke bomb, the two manage to escape. Kirei is at least able to take solace in knowing that Kiritsugu was here. Later, he finds Archer waiting in his chambers, who makes a subtle jab at Kirei's absence moments ago. Kirei feigns ignorance, implying that he probably shouldn't have left the church at the time, and might have done so without his father's knowledge. It's unknown if this is the case. It seems in line that Kirei should stay at the church, since doing the opposite might arouse suspicion. But at the same time, it seems unlikely that his father wouldn't notice his absence, which raises the question, is it a good or bad thing that he left the church? We'll come back to this. Kirei changes the topic and notes Archer's disappointment with his own master. The conversation moves to the topic of Tokiyomi's motivations and those of the other masters. Finally, Archer asks Kirei what he would ask for the Grail. He still doesn't know why the Grail chose him or what he'd wish for, even denying he has one at all. Archer suggests that even if he doesn't know what he wanted, he could just wish for something universally desired, joy being the first example. Immediately to which, Kirei denounces joy as both blasphemous and sinful, though he can't explain why. This is an interesting line for a couple of reasons. For one, he's quick to respond yet doesn't have any idea why he believes this. He doesn't even know what makes him happy or what his wish is either. Perhaps there's a connection. Maybe his wish is related to his warped views on joy. Maybe he would wish for whatever would make him happy, but whatever that is, he views it as blasphemous, yet still seeks it anyways. Perhaps he was taught such a desire was blasphemous, so he's denied ever knowing what that desire is in the first place. This adds context to Kiritsugu's investigation. We now understand that his desire is something so twisted that he was taught never to seek it, though it also makes the scene even more confusing in retrospect. Kiritsugu claimed that Kirei doesn't have a wish when that very clearly isn't true. Archer offers to help Kirei understand what brings him joy. He asks Kirei to study and report the plans and motivations of the other masters directly to him. He's obviously hoping this will tell him something about Kirei's motives and what he enjoys, but it's not clear why he chose this in particular. Granted, there's not much else he can assign, since Archer barely knows Kirei at this point. It's still somewhat questionable as to how he reached this idea, especially when, for all he knows, he may not find any interest in any of the masters. Kirei accepts and contemplates if studying Kiritsugu will help him better understand himself and what brings him joy. Roughly 24 hours later, Castor attacks Saber not long after his bounty is placed. Just as this draws Kaneth and Lancer's attention, Kirei sees this as a second opportunity to fight Kiritsugu. Once again, though, he is stopped by Kiritsugu's allies. He deals with Maya easily and tells them he hasn't come to fight them. He's already wasted one opportunity fighting the same woman last night, when he could have been pursuing Kiritsugu. The scene primarily exists to reinforce Kirei's misunderstanding. He doesn't seem to believe that the man would send his allies to fight him instead of meeting Kirei himself, that he is alone, understood by no one, and alike with Kirei in that regard. Maya and Airi meeting him in Kiritsugu's stead suggests otherwise, but he shrugs off the idea. A couple days pass and Ryder and Archer impose a banquet upon Saber at her hideout. Kirei believes that Ryder could possess some ability they aren't aware of, and Tokiomi suggests that they test that theory. All of the assassins attack the venue, and Ryder annihilates them using his noble phantasm. Kirei is now officially removed from the war. After discussing the exact nature of Ryder's power with Tokiomi, Kirei returns to his chambers where he again is greeted by Archer. Just as before, the two converse until the topic of recent events come up. Kirei describes his time in the war as an unpleasant burden, one that he is relieved to be done with. Archer isn't buying it though, but doesn't question him either. Instead, he asks what happens to the command seals after a master has been eliminated. Kirei explains in detail what happens to those command seals, but he's hesitant to disclose where they could potentially end up, or rather, who they could end up with. Command seals stay in our world until the end of the war, where they're given to the Overseer. But of those that are left unused could mark someone else as a master. What Kirei hesitates to disclose is that they tend to gravitate towards former masters. Even if the servant is defeated, there's still a chance that an eliminated master could rejoin if the Grail allows it. This is why masters kill masters, and not just the servants. Kirei's hesitation is actually a very subtle hint at character development. He doesn't want to consider the possibility that he'd be chosen once again. He wants to believe that the only reason the Grail chose him was to act as a support for Tokiomi, but given that both Lancer and Saber's teams had support mages that weren't masters themselves, we know this isn't true. Archer briefly disagrees, but the topic switches to Kirei's assignment. Luckily, he'd finished his research on the other masters before Assassin was killed. The information is more or less a brief summary of his understanding of the other masters. Lancer, Ryder, and Castor's master are all described rather briefly and without detail. Even Kiritsugu is given little note. Kirei is convinced he wasn't anything more than a hired mercenary to achieve someone else's dream. Ironic, given how he views himself the same way for Tokiomi. Although perhaps it isn't ironic and he still sees some of himself in Kiritsugu. That would be likely since he doesn't give up on his obsession here, but it is still somewhat confusing that he's lost interest in Kiritsugu so spontaneously just so that they can contrast with the one master he did report in detail. All of them were covered briefly, as though only the least amount of effort was spent on them. That is, except for Cardia. Archer concludes that this is because, out of all of the masters, Kirei found the most enjoyment in observing and researching him. But Kirei denies this. Someone whose circumstances are as tragic as Cardia's couldn't possibly be a source of joy to him. Any amount of joy he could find out of someone else's suffering is what he's been taught is both sinful and blasphemous. And there it is. This is why he views joy as a sin, because what makes him joyful is the suffering of others. He is a sadist who's been groomed and taught to reject such ideas his entire life, yet he feels his cruel and twisted desires building up. Bit by bit, more and more of his character is revealed as he discovers more about himself and what brings him joy. But what sadistic wish exists within his heart is still something we don't know. Before he can say any more, Kirei's command seals reappear on his hand. The Holy Grail has chosen him to fight once more. He can deny it all he wants, but deep in his heart he still harbors a wish. But to achieve it, he'd have to betray his master. Regardless, he's part of the war once again. It is a little strange that he doesn't go out of his way to hide his command seals. It's a little hard to believe that Tokiomi wouldn't notice given that Kirei doesn't wear a glove. On the topic of the command seals, this could be viewed as a deus ex machina since it reappeared for no other reason than that the Grail wanted it to, but it's at least somewhat narratively fitting that they should reappear at this very moment. At the beginning of the scene, Kirei had all but accepted that his time in the war was at an end, and sounded content with that fact. He had even given up on his obsession with chasing Kiritsugu, but now that Archer is presenting him with his deepest desire, that wish is resurfacing. Hence why it chose now to restore Kirei's position. In a way, Archer not only brought out his sadistic nature, but could also be partially responsible for him regaining his command seals. A couple more days passed, and Castor begins his demonic attack from the river. That's right, we're calling back to it. By the time Kirei arrives, Tokiomi has already engaged with Karia. After Karia's defeat and fall from the balcony, Kirei moves in to complete any job left unfinished. But Archer's words echo in his mind, and he begins to deny his interest in Karia less and less. Instead of killing him, he uses healing magic to revive him. He returns Karia to the Mato mansion for his wounds to be properly tended to. As he walks home, he ruminates on his actions. He had just betrayed his own mentor by assisting another master. In fact, he enjoyed it. Kirei returns to the church only to find that his father had been shot. He informs Tokiomi of these events the following morning, after having procured the command seals previously left with Risei. Between Castor's attack and now Risei's death, Tokiomi prepares a strategy to eliminate Rider's master and keep any outsiders from winning. To accomplish this, Tokiomi asks Saber's team for assistance. Afterwards, Archer confronts Kirei yet again, noting how emotionless he appears despite losing his father. Tokiomi, a man related to Risei only by friendship, shows more emotion about his death than his own son. In fact, Archer implies that Kirei is only upset because he didn't get to kill Risei himself. We're given more and more information about just how sadistic Kirei truly is. Despite wanting to kill his father, he is distinct from someone like Ryunosuke. If the two were alike in any way, then Kirei would have let Karia die. It seems that he finds enjoyment out of the misery and pain rather than just the kill. The puzzle that is Kirei's motivation is almost complete. The only thing we have left to understand is the wish that he would have the Grail grant him. With omnipotent power and an insidious personality, we can only imagine what that wish might be. Nightfall comes, and Saber and Irisfiel arrive at the church to discuss a ceasefire. The two teams come to an agreement to deal with Rider and Berserker before continuing their battle with each other. It's unknown how exactly Tokiomi knows that Karia is alive, given that recent events should be more than enough reason to suspect he's long dead, and there's no way Kirei would have told him, since he'd want to avoid all suspicion. Irisfiel agrees to the ceasefire under the condition that Kirei be expelled from Japan. She describes bad blood existing between him and the Einsburn family, but we're not told what this bad blood is. I assume it has to do with how Kirei made multiple attempts on Kiritsugu's life when he should have been eliminated, and further that the church had unfairly conspired with him and Tokiomi. This only raises the question of how Risei didn't know Kirei was sneaking out at night once again, only now it's far less forgivable since it's the centerpiece for an incredibly important moment in Kirei's story. We're not told what exactly Irisfiel is referring to, which is still equally problematic. Regardless, Kirei is unable to say anything that would change Tokiomi's mind, but he had a more devious plan than simply convincing him. Kirei returns to his chambers yet again, wondering if he'll ever learn Kiritsugu's true motivations. A strange contrast, given the last time he was mentioned, Kirei made it sound as though he no longer had any interest in Kiritsugu, or maybe Kirei was only able to discern the least interesting parts about his background. It is still a strange 180 for his character to take at this point. Archer joins him not long after Kirei finishes packing his bags when they receive a phone call. Someone, presumably controlled by magic, informed Kirei the location of the second Einsburn hideout. He had no intention of quitting the war, even from the very beginning, and by disobeying Tokiomi's agreement, Archer will have to take action against him. But instead of fighting, Kirei appeals to Archer's self-interest. The ritual to summon the Holy Grail requires the sacrifice of all 7 heroic spirits, which would include Archer as well. Were he to remain loyal to Tokiomi, he would be sacrificed in order to summon the Grail. This is, admittedly, one of the more confusing aspects about Fate Zero. Up until this point, the exact nature of the Grail has been comprehensive, albeit still somewhat vague. Both the Master and Servant enter a pact with one another upon summoning, and both have their own reasons for wanting the Grail. so it's been presumed that the Grail would grant both of their wishes, provided that they didn't conflict with one another. Otherwise, why would heroes choose to serve anyone with no consideration for their interests? But even if it only granted one of their wishes, it was still implied that it was possible for both servant and master to last until the Grail was claimed. This is now untrue. Were he to serve someone else, so long as they wanted the Grail, Archer would still have to be sacrificed in order to claim it. A counter to this is that the sacrifice of all spirits is only required to reach the root, a goal that Tokiomi harbors exclusively. So then, as long as another master holds goals other than reaching the root, this wouldn't apply. But this scene also proves this wrong.
7人のサーバントを全て殺し尽くすことで大聖杯を起動させる。
If that's the case, then Archer would still need to be sacrificed even if he serves Kirei. There is no distinction made between the activation of the Grail and simply making a wish on it. If there is a difference, then the scene is delivering extremely misleading information. It is not a small problem by any means, and Archer's betrayal is hinged on him ignoring that he'd still have to be sacrificed either way. I also think it throws a lot of what we understand about the structure of the war and how master-servant relationships are meant to be maintained, but I don't want to go too deep into that criticism because, from what I understand, the Grail can still grant a wish from only 6 sacrifices. The issue here is mainly the confusion that's created by delivering information as though that isn't true. Before his supposed departure, Kirei is given one final gift from Tokiomi, an Azoth dagger signifying his mastery of magic. The very same that Kirei would use to murder his own master. One can't help but wonder if this is how he envisioned killing his father. His expulsion from the war was simply an excuse to execute his master. But given his motivations, it's hard to imagine a scenario where Kirei wouldn't have murdered Tokiomi. A betrayal like this was precisely what made him happy. So happy, in fact, that he might not have regretted losing the chance to kill Rise. Before the night is over, Archer forms a new pact with Kirei as his master, promising him the Grail if he continues to act as a source of entertainment. With only 4 teams remaining in the war, Kirei makes preparations to kidnap Irisfeel so he can use her to summon the Grail, while simultaneously readying his entertainment for the night. Kirei appeals to Karia by promising to bring him Tokiomi so he can enact his revenge. In exchange, Karia would use Berserker to kidnap Irisfeel for him, while using an ability to make him appear like Rider to throw off any rescue attempts. It seems rather convenient that Berserker just happened to have a shape-shifting ability to properly get away from Saber. What's more convenient is that Kirei wasn't expecting the original Rider to be nearby, further facilitating Berserker's escape. This isn't a small issue at all, but luckily it doesn't contradict anything either. Kirei lies to further help Karia in his pursuits, not only for revenge, but also to achieve the Holy Grail. But he knows that Karia doesn't have it in him to outlast Rider, let alone Archer and Saber. Additionally, as mentioned in Karia's section earlier, the incident at the church was all set up by Kirei, so he could watch Karia's misery and despair grow more and more. At this point in his arc, Kirei has completely accepted his sadistic personality. But who will be his next victim? Whose dreams does he plan to crush next the way that he did to Karia? We learn more when Irisfeel wakes up after being kidnapped. Now Kirei appeals to her, suggesting that soon he will be the only one that can grant the Ainsburn wish, as though to leverage it against her while she's helpless. I'm not sure if this was meant to taunt her, or if there was something Kirei truly wanted from Irisfeel through false promises. It's not dissimilar to how he promised Karia the Grail either, but ultimately she rejects anything he has to offer. She could never find it in herself to ally with Kiritsugu's greatest enemy. The way she describes him in Kiritsugu's eyes doesn't seem to faze Kirei. In fact, he's delighted. Kiritsugu sounds every bit like how he envisioned him to be, a man who had put himself at the forefront of many battles time and time again, who had sought out violence and destruction at its most pinnacle, and devoid of life, who instinctively searched for these things, but this only made his disillusion grow more and more. He used the phrase, wasted effort, to describe these actions, that there was nothing to be gained from these actions except, possibly, a level of enjoyment. Kirei wholeheartedly believed that Kiritsugu was so interested in these battles for the same reason Kirei was interested in Karia, enjoyment. Only now that he's accepted his own sadism, his offer to Irisfeel might not have been a lie, but possibly a chance to get closer to Kiritsugu. But Irisfeel completely shatters these beliefs. Kiritsugu's wish for the Grail was nowhere near what Kirei could have assumed it would be. He wanted a world without war and conflict, and only a device as powerful as the Holy Grail could grant him that wish. Kirei finally sees Kiritsugu as he truly is. Everything he thought he understood was completely wrong. Not only are these two different in every way, but their ideas directly conflict with one another. In his frustration, Kirei slowly chokes the life out of Irisfield, before swearing to destroy Kiritsugu's dream and watch him suffer as it happens. Later, Kirei fires off a signal flare to announce his presence to the other masters. Using Archer and Karia, he systematically removes each master that comes his way before finally meeting with Kiritsugu himself. We've gone more than 20 episodes, and this is the first time these two characters have faced one another in the same room. Up until now, each character has only ever been motivated by the other. Now the fight that their arcs have been building up to since the very first episode can begin. And I can say with certainty, it is the best fight scene in the entire anime by a wide margin. Every moment leading up to its climax is completely comprehensive and displayed in great methodical detail. So many elements become crucial determinants to the outcome of the battle. The resources of both combatants, how quickly they consume them, the speed they move, how quickly they react, the knowledge they both have of the other, all of it is essential to the way that the fight concludes. Both Kirei and Kiritsugu have advantages and disadvantages in different areas, and the fight itself isn't a one-sided battle, not even in favor of the main antagonist. This makes it especially distinct from many other fight scenes in anime, which tend to increase tension by making the antagonistic side more powerful than the other, or generally give them the upper hand in some way. But the fight here is far more grounded. Tension is maintained, but not at the expense of either side. As the final fight sequence of Fate Zero, it deserves to be as great as it is. After the victor is decided, the only thing left is for the winner to claim the Grail and watch as events unfold. And as much as I'd take great pleasure in going into excruciating detail of the choreography of the fight beyond what's mentioned here, we will return to it. During the fight, other servants have been dying, and the Grail was beginning to form in the higher stories of the building, overflowing with a red substance that melts through the floors and consumes them both. Kiritsugu has his own experience while inside the Holy Grail. In short though, what he saw wasn't what he had hoped for. He no longer wants what the Grail can offer, but he can't allow it to fall into Kirei's hands either. He can't allow anyone to have it. He can't even allow the Grail to exist. Kirei pleads with him not to kill the Grail. It was the only means that he could find the wish in his heart that would bring meaning to his life. Begging was all he could do at this point. But Kirei awakens amongst the ruins of what used to be the Fuyuki Citizens Building and its surrounding area. Archer was the one who dug him out from beneath the debris, but it was the Grail that brought him back to life, and gave Archer physical form. Having fought to get this far, Kirei was now the only master remaining with a servant. Archer points out that if they truly won the war, then the conflagration around them is the result of Kirei's wish. Staring off at the horrible chaos of the fire and destruction, the conflagration that caused the death of nearly 500 innocent people, infamous in Fate Stay Night, all he could do was laugh. He had now come face to face with the incarnation of his deepest desire, and the one thing that could bring him joy. But this wasn't enough for him. He had to know more. He had long since asked himself what wish could possibly bring him joy in his life. But though the answer was simply given to him, the method for him to obtain it again still eluded him. Kirei turns to see Kiritsugu in the distance, searching beneath the rubble for any signs of life, his eyes completely filled with a dark, hopeless void. Nothing could be more pathetic in Kirei's eyes. He truly was everything Irisfield described him as, the exact opposite of Kirei. So he turns his back to Kiritsugu and gives up on the man who he used to be so fascinated with. As a final conclusion to his arc, he returns to bury Tokiomi and offers to train his daughter as a mage. He then presents her with an Azoth dagger to signify her growth, the very same that he used to murder her father. Kirei's story is a character study of a sadist on a journey of self-discovery, and its structure complements that motif well. The viewer is told very little about Kirei from the very beginning. Little is known about him beyond what's merely told to us through secondhand sources. We learn more about Kirei as he learns more about himself. His arc isn't even one of overcoming some outside obstacle or even an enemy, but rather his own limitations and self-reflection. It is essentially his upbringing to becoming a villain, slowly realizing and accepting the pleasure he finds in sadistically playing with others' lives. But his story is emblematic of the bigger issues in Fate Zero and lacks an understanding of the importance of these story elements. Some of these were brought up in previous sections, such as Saber choosing to doff her armor against Lancer when it doesn't benefit her and is more so just to excuse how she loses her left arm, and Lancer failing to kill Castor when he has the perfect opportunity. These are problems that one likely wouldn't notice on an initial viewing, and the story tries to treat them as unimportant, but they have drastic implications that ripple out through the story, and as we've seen from Kirei, there's no shortage of that here either. Any implications that the death of his wife could have had prior to the anime are absent from the story altogether. It's implied that Kirei shouldn't leave the premises of the church, yet he's never caught when he leaves to hunt Kiritsugu. Additionally, because of the times that he leaves, we're left to assume that his disregard for the rules results in creating bad blood between him and the Einsburn family, which then results in his expulsion from the war. This is even more contrived because the inciting incident for the meeting where Kirei is expelled is Kirei Kotomine's death. A death that sort of implies he has almost no countermeasures against a master simply entering the church and killing him there. Compounding this is how neither his father nor Tokiomi notice his command seals that reappeared, which should affect their opinion of Kirei's loyalty. Kirei's most successful attack on Kiritsugu is only because an arbitrary unexplained outside force happened to locate Kiritsugu's new hideout. This incredibly important element in Kirei's story is neither addressed or explained. The incredible convenience that Ryder happened to be nearby when Berserker kidnapped Irisveal, which would have put a hinge in Kirei's plans if they weren't there. And the poor explanation about the number of sacrifices needed for the Grail, which serves to create more confusion than anything. Not the least of which is how Kirei's wish is granted at the end if Archer didn't need to be sacrificed after all. These are small in the sense that they are easy to miss, but they are not small problems. Fate Zero has a bad habit of treating such problems as though they are, and it damages a lot of the overall narrative when you notice them. Whether there's still more is something we'll have to explore as we go. But despite all of that, I think it's much better than what we have in Bladeworks. Don't get me wrong, of course, Kirei is still better than every other character in the same show that we've talked about up until now, save for Assassin. I dislike his absence, but I find it more plausible than Ilia's. Being the Overseer no doubt grants him advantages, so he'd want to play the part of an Overseer to best trick the other Masters. But even if I don't think there's much wrong with him as a character, I'm unimpressed with him as a villain. In this route anyway. The show treats him more like a video game boss than an actual character, and I say video game boss deliberately because I'm pretty sure even Borderlands poked fun at this concept.
I'm glad somebody is actually making an effort to fight other gladiators! The rest of you horks are just sitting around waiting for challengers to come to you! Tease!
Kirei from Fate Zero was investing as a villain because he had a ton of effect on the world and the other characters. He antagonized more than plenty. He manipulates others, sometimes just because he enjoyed it, and he had far more initiative than he does in Bladeworks. He took the first chance he had to attack Kiritsugu not one, but 2 consecutive nights in a row. Hell, a majority of the conflict Kiritsugu has is trying to avoid him entirely. He uses Kiritsugu's own plans as a way to draw him out 3 times in the anime. First with Kaneth, second with Castor, and the third is when Kirei was expelled, making Kiritsugu believe it was safe to leave Irisveal unprotected while he attacked Tokiomi, when that was anything but true. I almost find it hard to believe that these are supposed to be the same person. Zero's Kirei seems to me like the kind of person who would actually use his stance as the Overseer to manipulate the other combatants of Stay Night, just for the fun of it, Shiro most of all, while Bladeworks Kirei comes off as someone who would watch paint dry as a hobby. I sometimes feel like I understand Kirei more from Zero than I do from Bladeworks because, as I've already shown, I can actually appreciate his character arc even without any other knowledge from Fate. Even Castor by herself has a larger impact on the world than Kirei's team for most of the story. And if that's how he's supposed to be in Bladeworks, I suppose that's fine. I'm just not impressed by him. Imagine if in Fate Zero they waited to have the cat and mouse game between Kirei and Kiritsugu until after Castor finished his conflict with Saber, and waited even longer before that until after Saber finished her duel with Lancer. I simply don't find very much investment in a villain that just deliberately waits around until the main characters have beaten the last level before they arbitrarily decide it's their turn. And when I say all of this, I don't mean those same kinds of villains, but who also use their resources and allies to progress their goals. Because even if they don't have an active hand in the story, they at least have agency towards progressing that story in some way. Gilgamesh is someone I can speak on later, but Lancer is mainly who I'm talking about when I say that. Out of everyone, he seems to me like the first enemy Shiro would prioritize in the story, not because Lancer killed him, but because Lancer killed a student. Anyone could have been there that night, any number of other people could have seen Lancer before or after, and Shiro has reason to suspect there's a connection with the serial stabbings. He has plenty of reason to believe Lancer has killed innocent people before, and might again, so he should want to locate Lancer, find out if he has killed anyone else, and stop him and his master if he has. No matter what route this is, Kirei and Lancer should always be involved in some way for this reason. Instead, they're treated more as an afterthought. You could almost give Kirei the Zoken treatment and write him out of this route, even if he still exists in the world. It would have solved much of the problems with his death scene, and the only thing you'd actually need to fix is find another way to kill off Lancer. Though I have another reason I wouldn't prefer that. Kirei is not only the rival of Shiro's father, but the murderer of Rin's father. Given that Rin is the love interest of this route, building up to a confrontation with him and having her personally avenge the death of her father would fit incredibly well as a climax to her journey. And what is that journey exactly? Well, let's talk about that as we analyze the Tosakas.